Okay, so let's get into the full human figure, and we'll talk about proportions. I want to talk about, how many heads high, the differences between a man and a woman, down to a child and a baby, all these different things. The one thing I do want to stress is that, just like I've said in all my other videos, the human body comes in a lot of shapes and sizes, and so these proportions that I'm going to be talking about, it's very, very general, okay? Some websites, if you look them up, they'll be called the ideal proportions. I hate to say that because, you know what, there's no such thing as ideal. We come in all shapes and sizes. We're all beautiful, except for me, but everybody has their own proportions. And these proportions I'm going to talk about today are, like I said, they're general. And I'm also a firm believer in the rule of if it looks good, it is good. Okay? So even though I'm going to be showing you, head lengths and heights and arm lengths and all that kind of stuff, I keep this in the back of my mind, but I really don't go down and start, measuring head lengths and all that kind of stuff. If it looks right to me, it is right. And lo and behold, a lot of the times, these proportions that I'm going to show you will match up, okay? So why don't we go ahead and dive in? And so what I've done is I've gone ahead and prepared, like I've done in my other videos, I've prepared some drawings that will show you the human figure and generally, head heights and stuff like that. So I figured we could just dive in. So first, let's just talk about a man. So, if you look at, there's a lot of, it goes back and forth consensus-wise. It goes back and forth between, is the ideal height 8 heads high? Is it 7.5 heads? It really varies. It depends on if the person's tall. If they're really tall, they tend to have, more heads to their height. If they tend to be short or shorter, then they're going to have less heads to their height. So it really varies. I mean, it could be 7 heads, it could be 8 heads, it could be 6.5 heads. I chose to go 7.5. To me, that's more ideal than, and probably more common than 8 heads high. And so that's what I've done here. And so you'll notice, obviously a head length or a head height is from the top of the head, I'm not including the hair, from the top of the head to the bottom of the chin. That's our head height, okay? And as we go down, I want you to see it goes down to 7.5, all the way down to the feet, all right? Now, there's different things we can look at within that to make some other measurements. For instance, coming down to the hips and the navel right here, that's generally about 3 head heights from the top of the head, okay, as you come down. If you look at the width of the shoulders of this guy, and he's pretty well built. He's very athletic. If you look at the width of his shoulders, he's 2.5 heads wide. And as we get into some of the other people, like a woman, child, baby, you're going to see these proportions will change. Also, the distance from the top of the head to the shoulders, that's usually about 1.5 heads, okay? Once again, I'm just going to reiterate, these are general measurements. Another length that some people struggle with because sometimes they make the arms too long, and that is the arms. The arms tend to be from the top of the shoulder to the end of the outstretched fingers, about 3.5 heads. You can also think about it from the end of the fingers to the break in the arm to the elbow, about 2 heads, and about 1.5 heads from the elbow to the top of the shoulder. Okay, you can think of it that way. Also, from the top of the head to the crotch, right down here, which is basically, the bottom of the torso, you're going to have about 4 heads and 3.5 heads from the crotch to the bottom of the feet. It's almost 4.5 heads, or it's basically a little less than 4.5 heads from the hips on a man down to the bottom of the feet. So that the leg length from the very top of the hip is about 4.5, somewhere in there. Now you can see here, I've marked it right about the break in the leg, right about midway. You can see that's about 3.5 heads from the top of the head working down. It's about 3.5 heads down. Okay. The other thing I want to talk about on a male is, and this basically goes for the human figure, and this will be the same on females and kids and babies and all that. I'm going to take this and I'm going to turn the arm off. So now you can see we've got a guy with no arm. But the reason I did that was I wanted to make a point. And that is the human figure has flow. And we're going to talk more about this in some later videos. But the human figure has a flow to it. And I'm going to show you that. And this is, obviously our character is standing straight up and down. But you can see there's a slight, that head is, and the neck is cocked forward just slightly. It doesn't go perfectly straight up and down. That's a mistake a lot of people make. It actually is cocked forward, and you can see that it comes into the chest, and then there's this sweeping feel to the chest. And actually, as it feeds into the legs, you can even stretch that sweeping feel out all the way down into the thighs. You see that? So you get this nice, fluid S shape going through the body, and then down through the calves and into the feet. Okay? And that's going to be a general standing gesture for a human. It's how we take the weight, it's how we balance, okay? And we'll talk more about that when we get into more specific anatomy. But, these are things I don't want you to think about as we move forward, and I'll point them out when we get into gesture drawing and flow and all of that. There's fluidity to the body, okay? Things aren't just attached and clunky. There's fluidity, and you need to find how those things flow. So after I teach you how to draw arms and legs and the torso and all that, I'm going to show you how to put them together in a nice fluid manner. All right? Let's go ahead and get into the woman now and talk about her proportions. Now, once again, a woman is about 7.5 heads high as well. Once again, it can change according to their height, but here I've gone ahead and made her 7.5. You can say, and you're going to say, well, she's not as tall as the man. Well, she's not. Women generally are shorter, and so she's 7.5 heads to her proportion. So it's her head that she's 7.5 heads of. Okay, if that makes sense. And women tend to be more slightly built. The muscles aren't quite as big on a woman. So, for instance, you can see in her shoulders, rather than being 2.5 heads wide like the man, she's going to be about 2 heads wide, okay? And you can see that her chest is quite a bit smaller. The pectoralis muscles, which will be located under her breasts, those generally aren't as developed, okay? And then once again, as we come down, if we count down from the top of the head, coming down just under 3 heads down is where you'll find the navel. It's just above, usually just above that 3 head mark. And also, if we come in here, and if I mark where the hips are, it's going to be about 2 2/3 heads down. If you see right here, it's about 2 2/3 from here to here, like so. All right. And then once again, just like the male is about 4 heads down to the crotch, and the female is about the same. It tends to be sometimes a little shorter, maybe 3 3/4. And you can see in this sense, and then in this instance, I've gone a little bit less than 4. Okay. And also, one other thing I forgot to mention on the male, and the same thing for the female, from the ground to the knee is usually about 2 heads. Okay? It's usually about 2 heads high from the ground to the knee. All right? And that's going to start breaking up your body proportions pretty nicely. Let's talk about a boy. Now, this is probably a 10, 11, maybe 12-year-old boy. And the other thing too, I mean, when you get to kids at this age, probably around 9 years old, boys and girls start to kind of split in their body proportions. Girls will start getting, so they'll start slowly getting, wider hips. They'll start getting the more female proportions. Boys will start getting wider in the shoulders, and they'll start going into the male proportions. But at about this age, at about 9, 10, they're kind of the same. So, you know, these heads could be interchangeable. But anyway, you'll notice that the proportions of the kids, and as we go into a baby, it gets even more dramatic. The proportions change. So now instead of being 7.5 heads, the head is bigger proportionately to the body. So now this 10-year-old or 9-year-old is now 7 heads, and sometimes maybe even 6 heads high, okay? And you'll notice the width of the shoulders. The width of the shoulders, only 1.5 heads. Very narrow shouldered, very slight. You know, this is the gangly age. You know, the kids are kind of klutzy at this age. They're falling down all the time. They're trying to figure out their coordination. And you know, a great example is Wart in The Sword and the Stone. You know, the Milt Kahl's animation and design of him, I just thought was fantastic, in the way he's just so gangly, and that's kind of his age in the story. And so why don't we go ahead and we'll jump over to the child. Now here's a baby that's probably about a year old, maybe a year and a half. And all of a sudden we've gone from 7 heads. Now look at the proportions here. We've gone, and now they're just 4 heads high. And this is where we start getting into cute proportions. All right, there are proportions that we instinctively see as cute. And I think it kind of activates nurturing responses in us, and this is nature's way of. I mean, if you look at not just humans, if you look at puppies and kittens and, you know, little baby animals, they all have these same proportions, and I think we're wired to see these as cute, and it triggers these nurturing instincts in us. You'll also notice that the baby, especially if you compare it to the boy, who's gotten, you know, he's lost all his baby fat, he's gangly, he's wiry, he's long and thin, the baby still has all the fat. And so, you know, you can see that I've kind of created these, you know, lots of little fat rolls. Boom, boom, boom. You know, babies just are full of them. Look at the calves. They're just little stumps. You know, they're full of fat. You know, look at the shape of the torso into the belly. It's just, you know, this round little shape. Little, I always call them little puppy tummies. You know, they've got these little, you know, round bellies. And also, if you look at the head proportions, you know, if you remember when we talked about proportions on the adult head, it was about from the top of the head to the bottom of the chin. It was about halfway. But on the baby, it's going to come down below half. And then there's the little nose and then the little mouth. And so you get, and the eyes tend to be further apart. Okay, and then these little ears that stick out, and those make, you know, cute proportions. Round cheeks, all of that. 4 heads high, and really only about a head width in the shoulders. Very, very slight, very small. The head is really dominant. The head's really big. You know, that's why babies, you know, they can't really hold them up. You know, their necks are small. They're still developing their muscles. Okay, so I wanted to show you this just very briefly, just to keep in mind some of the proportions. Like I said, I rarely sit down and start measuring out proportions on my drawings. It's just, if I did that every time, I'd never get a drawing done. I really believe in, once again, if it looks good, it is good. Now, if you're having problems and you can't figure something out, or something doesn't quite look right, well then maybe you revert back to some of these proportions and try to find where things go wrong or went wrong. But generally, I just kind of keep this in mind over, you know, and you'll get better and better at it as through repetition. You'll just naturally start to see these proportions. We are humans. We see people every single day, and we can tell if something's out of proportion, okay? So the next thing I'd like to do is, now that we've gotten that out of the way, I'd like to start talking about some of the different body parts and how they're built, some of the rhythms, like, you know, the arms, the legs, the torso. Let's start talking about some of them, and then we'll get into how everything's put together. So why don't we go ahead and move on.